Hello and welcome to Harshmeet Study Circle. We are now at chapter number 4 of this year's economic survey. We have been summarizing these chapters one by one. We already did the first 3 chapters. This is now the turn of chapter number 4. If you have not watched the first 3 videos, do watch that. The link of the entire playlist is in the description of this video. Do go through that as well. The 4th chapter talks about within the country. The last chapter, as you know, chapter number 3 was about investments coming into India. Now economic survey in chapter number 4 talks about prices and inflation. As you know, inflation targeting has been a major concern for Indian government for many years. In India, targeting of inflation is a responsibility of the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India. They have their own monetary policy committee that makes sure that inflation remains between 2 to 6% in India. Very high inflation means the prices of commodities is increasing, which they would not want, and inflation below 2% also is bad because it means that the economy is not growing as much as it should. So this year's economic survey in chapter number 4 talks about how the inflation has been in India and what factors have contributed to fluctuations, increasing or decreasing inflation within the country, and some factors outside the country as well. This chapter also talks about inflation in different areas like fuel inflation, food inflation, etc. So let's break it down. Let's see what this chapter has for us. So as I said, chapter number 4 talks about all these things. Let's start with the key themes of this chapter. The first one being the global inflation trend. So it talks about how inflation has been globally. Now inflation in simple definition means increase in the prices of commodities. Now increase in price of commodities can be due to various things. Number one, there can be a sudden increase in demand that doesn't happen suddenly, or there can be disruption in the supply chain. Means, for example, because of Ukraine-Russia war, sunflower oil that is produced in very large quantity in Ukraine could not be distributed around the world. So the commodity, the supply chain disrupted, the supply was lesser, so the prices would increase. Similarly, food grains, rice and wheat, these are exported to the world from Ukraine and Russia. Because of their fluctuations, because of their war, they could not supply that to the world. So usually when you see fluctuations or when you see inflation around the world, it is mainly got to do because maybe there was a natural disaster that hurt those areas where there was production, or there are these global events such as war. This is what happened this time. So inflation around the world fluctuated. Although it became better in 2024, in 2023 it was much higher. Supply chain disruption still remain a concern because Ukraine-Russia war is still ongoing. Inflation was better in US and EU specifically. So their central banks with that were taking out money from the market now became much more accommodative. There is rising price of oil around the entire world because of tension in the Middle East as well. But India benefited from this slowdown of inflation. So again, as compared to 2023, at least in 2024, global inflation did slow down, because of which our domestic prices were stable. So it was a better year for inflation in 2024 as compared to 2023. Now, economic survey talks about inflation in the country. That was about international inflation or domestically. A few things. Number one, our headline inflation remains moderate, average 4.8%. Again, please remember, the target of inflation that we keep in the country is 2 to 6%, and it is RBI's Monetary Policy Committee who has the responsibility to manage this inflation. Some other parts of inflation is core inflation. So when core inflation is calculated, they don't consider food and fuel. This remained low because of a stable monetary policy by the RBI. Food inflation was a concern, means the prices of commodities such as food grains, etc., that remained high, volatile. Why? So mainly it was because the supply chain in agriculture was disrupted because of many weather events that disrupted the food production. So unseasonal rains affected vegetable prices. Because of unseasonal rains, some of the stocks got destroyed and the prices suddenly increased. Fuel inflation specifically was not very high because the government intervened in excise duty. So for example, if the fuel prices globally increase, the government reduced the tax so that end consumer would have to pay the same. So while the food was a concern in terms of inflation, in terms of weather events, fuel was not really a concern because the government handled that better. As I said, food price inflation was a major highlight that economic survey pointed towards. Economic survey said that vegetables, cereals, pulses, they remain Now their prices remained high because of volatility. Government did take some action. For example, the government did have a buffer stock for rice and wheat, but still for vegetables you can't have a buffer stock. See, you can have a buffer stock for those products that have a long shelf life, so rice, wheat, etc. But then when they are perishable products such as vegetables and fruits, you can't store them for a long time, and that is why controlling prices in those food items becomes a very challenging task. Kharif and Rabi harvest were also the key determinants in deciding how the prices would be. So we struggled a bit on the food front. On the fuel front, it was not so much of a task, although the prices were fluctuating globally. But as I said, government did make some tax adjustments. Apart from that, one other interesting thing was that India continued to focus heavily on renewable energy, because of which we were able to reduce our dependency on fossil fuel. For example, as you know, our ethanol blending program is going on. We are targeting a 20% ethanol mixing with petrol by the end of 2025. We are en route to do that. So as we increase the blending of ethanol with petrol, obviously the import of petrol or crude oil will decrease. Although it won't happen immediately, but it is a long-term goal. Our focus on renewable energy has made sure that fuel inflation does not affect us as much as it used to earlier. What has RBI done? RBI for most part of the year maintained a tight monetary policy, means to suck out money supply from the market. As you know, it's basic economics. When the price of the commodities is increasing, usually what the RBI does, they try to take out money from the market. When you don't have enough money in your hand, you won't buy stuff. When you won't buy stuff, the prices will automatically decrease. How do they take out money from the market? By making it difficult for you to take a loan, by making it expensive for you to take a loan, by not giving banks enough free money to give you the loan. So that is what RBI did. For most part, the repo rate was at 6.5%, making it difficult for the banks to give loans, making it difficult for the people to afford loan from the bank. RBI's policy aimed at controlling liquidity while ensuring sufficient credit availability for the growth as well. So RBI tried to maintain a balance between growth and inflation, because see, the problem with this is if RBI takes out too much money from the market, then also it's a problem, because when people don't have money, they won't be able to invest, there won't be any growth in the market. So when RBI decides any specific repo rate or any other policy measure, they have to find a balance between inflation and maintaining growth as well. So they're doing a tricky job here. The economic survey, just like other chapters, in this chapter also talks about the risks that are involved. So there are short-term risks for inflation. The biggest short-term risk is the climate-related events, drought, floods, etc. You can't control them, and they can supply your food or your food production, so that will push the food prices higher. Oil, because we are still dependent on our oil supply, over close to 80 to 85% of our oil comes from outside. So any fluctuations in the global market will have an impact. And then global supply chain also could be affected, because all the spare parts of the machines or manufacturing, etc., coming from outside. Long term, what is the strategy? Strengthen our agriculture supply chain to make sure that we reduce the price shocks. It can't be done after a certain extent, because agriculture is something that is so weather related, weather dependent, and you can't really control over. Then enhance your storage infrastructure. Make sure that the food grains are not lying in the open as much as you can store to reduce any fluctuation in the price, and expand renewable energy even more to make sure the fuel prices don't affect you. This is what the long-term strategy suggested by the economic survey in chapter number 4. This was the important takeaway from chapter 4. As always, I have a quiz for you from this chapter as well. Let's see how much did you digest. First, what was the primary driver of food inflation in India in FY25? We just discussed high MSP, supply chain disruption, vegetable and pulses, declining food production, or rising rural demand. What was the reason behind food inflation? We discussed it was supply chain disruption because of extreme weather events, because of which we did not have a stable output for vegetables, fruits, pulses, etc. One more question. Which of the following measures help control fuel inflation in India? Again, fuel inflation. We talked about food, now fuel. Increased crude import, expansion of renewable energy, higher excise duties, or trade restriction on oil export. These are the two that we talked about. Higher excise duty, it was actually the opposite of it. When the global price of fuel increased, the government cut down on excise duty so that it is still the same price that the end consumer is paying. It is actually expansion on renewable energy. We discuss how we are pushing towards renewable energy, solar, wind, green hydrogen, etc., so that our dependence on crude oil reduces, so that we are not feeling as much shock of any increase in the global price of fuel. I have one more question for you for this chapter. Which of the following was a major risk to India's inflation outlook in FY25? High fiscal deficit, geopolitical conflict and global oil price fluctuations, decreasing urban demand, overproduction in agriculture. Major risk to our inflation outlook means the projection of inflation that we had, what can put it at risk, what is something that is outside our control, that is geopolitical conflict and global oil price fluctuation. We don't have any control over it. So if something like this happens, or the war or the conflicts continue, it might have an impact in the long run and our inflation targeting may go haywire. That is why the answer here is B. This was chapter number 4. I hope you have been learning a lot from this series where we are summarizing this year's economic survey. Chapter number 5 will be out tomorrow. Also, if you are new here, do hit the subscribe button. You can join my Telegram channel as well and download my app. The link of both of these in the description of the video. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Jai Hind.